how New Zealand green got rolled up in the U.S. drug war.
That's right.
Ain't that true?
That's the focus of what I'd like to ask you,
Yeah.
that specifically. And as you pointed out, the US is not exactly a role model in a sense for drug policy.
Yeah.
Why do you think so many countries emulate their policies then?
Well, I mean, the U.S., my government, we've been the superpower for many years, and we were emotionally and politically committed to driving this war on drugs strategy. And so my government was relentless for many, many decades on this front. I mean, really driving the U.S. approach. Our Drug Enforcement Administration became the most international police force in history. We advocated our methods. We strong-armed and provided incentives for other governments to sign on to increasingly prohibitionist global conventions. And I think other governments knew that if they dissented, the U.S. Congress could actually act sort of emotionally and angrily and hurt other governments. Paradoxically, my country is now leading the world on sensible cannabis policies. You know, in terms of public opinion, in terms of medical marijuana, now with Colorado and Washington, hopefully other states later on this year. So paradoxically, the United States has emerged as the global leader on cannabis reform, and I'm very, very proud of that fact. But the fact of the matter is legislators are oftentimes slow to respond to public opinion on a controversial issue like this, and the ballot initiatives are expensive. I and others have to raise the money to put them on the ballot. So I wish the dominoes would all just start falling, and if public opinion were all that mattered, they would be falling, but the process is going to be a lot more challenging than that. When you look back at our history with alcohol prohibition, I mean, it began as a sort of pragmatic temperance movement to reduce the harms of alcohol. But then what happened was a prohibitionist mindset began to take over the temperance movement and ultimately resulted in us changing our Constitution with the 18th Amendment to basically ban alcohol production and sales. It looked like it worked for a few years, and then it stopped working. So that by the end of alcohol prohibition, as many people were drinking as at the beginning, more people were drinking hard liquor than beer and wine. The booze was more dangerous because it was being produced illegally. And Al Capone and organized crime and violence and corruption had just sort of taken off like wildfire in many cities and states in America. That's why Americans chose to repeal alcohol prohibition. If you look today at global drug prohibition, it's like our experience in the US with alcohol prohibition times 50. You look at the violence in Mexico. You look at the drug trafficking through the Caribbean and Central America. You look what's happening in West Africa. You look at Afghanistan. You look even at the less violent but fairly pervasive illicit trade in marijuana and other drugs all around the world. You look at the size of the black markets. You look at the corruption that's involved. You look at the empowerment of organized criminals. I mean, it looks a lot like what we had with alcohol prohibition. And in both cases, of course, the drugs are more dangerous. With alcohol as a dangerous drug to begin with, although most people can use it safely, prohibition made it more dangerous. Bathtub gin and backyard stills. Similarly today, amphetamines are a dangerous drug, but when you're cooking up meth in a backyard lab, it's a lot more dangerous both for the people making it and the people consuming it. So prohibition makes drugs more dangerous. I think what Eric Holder did in the US, the Justice Department, I would not call it a white flag. I would call it actually something resembling leadership. Because the fact of the matter is, on an issue like this, it's very unusual to have the President and the Attorney General take a bold position before any governor of the 50 states has done it, before any senator has. We still don't have, elected politicians at the statewide level embracing the legal regulation of marijuana. But the President has described Colorado and Washington as important steps forward. The Attorney General has given directives to allow Colorado and Washington to try to implement these things, and even to allow the marijuana industry to do business with federally regulated banks. So I don't think it's a white flag. I think it's a recognition that public opinion has shifted rapidly, and that they need to find the best way to deal with this. And in that sense, although their verbiage has not been bold, I actually think they're showing some leadership. And I should say, I say this after having been a fierce critic of their lack of leadership during the first term of the Obama administration. There's two national models worth paying attention to. The first is Israel with respect to medical marijuana, because that too, like New Zealand, is a country that doesn't have strong federal systems of independent states and counties and all this. It's a well-run, well-administered model that I think is exportable to other countries that want a well-regulated medical marijuana system. I think ditto with Uruguay. Uruguay still has yet to roll it out. There's going to be bumps along the way. All the critics are going to be seizing on each bump to say it's not working. But I think what Uruguay is trying to do is really making history in its own way. And in that sense, what Uruguay's done on marijuana, what Israel's done on medical marijuana, what New Zealand's now done with the psychoactive drugs regulation are all of a piece. I think the DEA is basically a police agency who's out there enforcing the laws and sometimes advocating for them. I think they made a big difference a few decades ago in teaching and encouraging foreign police agencies to adopt our types of techniques with undercover and surveillance and all this sort of stuff. But I don't think they're that deeply a political agency. I think that this is much more being driven, or was driven, by the moralism in my own country, by the domestic politics of my country. I mean, I sometimes, when I speak in Latin America, and people think that somehow the U.S. global drug war, it's not really about drugs, they'll say. It's really about advancing U.S. economic and political and security interests around the world. And I actually respond to that and say, no, it's not. Actually, the U.S. international drug war actually undermines U.S. economic and security and political interests around the world. You know, I mean, as an American, we essentially want every government to be more or less like Canada, right? Not like with violent conflicts. And so the way to think about U.S. drug policy, international U.S. drug policy, think of it as an international projection of a domestic psychosis. I mean, if I try to analyze my own involvement in this, I think I look back first to growing up in a fairly religious family. My dad was a rabbi. We grew up very Sabbath observant. And so I grew up with I grew up in a fairly religious tradition, fairly moral, this sort of thing. Then I went off to college when I was 18 in Montreal and was drinking and also smoking marijuana, or hashish, it was common then. And, I enjoyed it. It wasn't a problem for me or most of my friends. Some people it was a problem, and then people were getting arrested for that. And it just kind of struck me that there was something wrong with that. And then as I got older and began my research studies and became fascinated by international crime and law enforcement, I began to study it. And the more I learned and studied about the origins of drug prohibition and the way racism drove that, the more I understood the counterproductive consequences of our drug laws, the more that my sort of personal upbringing, my traditional upbringing, my own personal experience with cannabis and then with some of the other psychoactive drugs, and then this sort of deep learning persuaded me that this was really a cause worth committing my life to, and I have no regrets that I did so.